It was just past 8 a.m. on a gray Tuesday morning in Macon, Georgia, the kind where the sky hung low like wet concrete, and even the street lights seemed to struggle awake. On Vineville Avenue, nestled inconspicuously between a dry cleaner and a pawn shop, stood a tiny, no-frills diner. It was the sort of place where the coffee never quite hit the mark, yet the warmth of its people always made it worth pulling up a chair. Inside, Clarence Dupri was already settled in his usual booth, back against the wall, eyes occasionally drifting to the window. His army jacket, a veteran of countless years, was older than the clanking dishwasher in the back, its cuffs frayed and shoulders faded, yet meticulously clean. His beard, scruffy, but neatly trimmed, carried the faint comforting scent of black coffee and hand-rolled tobacco. Not cigarettes, but the kind lovingly crafted with a touch too much paper. Clarence was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was always with a quiet, unmistakable respect. "Morning, Mr. Dupri," greeted Carla, the waitress, as she approached. In her early 30s, a mother of two, she navigated the diner floor with the purposeful grace of a traffic cop, always with a genuine smile. "Hey, Carla, you got any more of that peach cobbler today?" Clarence asked, a rare hint of playfulness in his voice. She chuckled softly. "You know we don't start that till lunch. You want your usual?" Clarence simply nodded. There was no need for further words. She knew precisely what that meant. Scrambled eggs, grits, 2 strips of bacon, and toast, always with the caveat, if it's not burnt, coffee, black as night, no cream, no sugar. It was a ritual, unchanging and comforting. From behind the counter, Harold, the diner's owner, peered over his glasses, a knowing glint in his eye. "That man could run this place better than me with one hand behind his back," he murmured to Carla. "He's the only reason I don't walk out of here some days," she quietly affirmed. To the casual patron stepping through the door, Clarence might have appeared as little more than a man clinging to the fringes. No car, no fixed address, a single pair of shoes that had endured decades. Yet to the select few who truly mattered within the warm confines of this little diner, Clarence was family. A quiet presence, undeniably, but one whose silent trust was absolute. True to his nature, Clarence kept mostly to himself, slowly sipping his coffee, his gaze occasionally drifting to the news, flickering silently on the TV screen above the counter. A segment about veterans struggling to receive their benefits played across the screen. He didn't flinch, didn't react overtly. He simply exhaled slowly through his nose, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, and turned his attention back to the world outside the window. Beyond the diner's pain, the morning was gradually coming to life. Traffic was beginning to thicken, students making their way to Mercer, parents on the school run, and countless others hustling to beat the rush hour at Robins Air Force Base. Amidst this mundane morning routine, no one seemed to notice the black and white cruiser as it pulled up to the curb. The cruiser hadn't sped, nor had its sirens pierced the morning quiet. It simply arrived, 2 officers stepping out with an air of practiced routine. Perhaps, for them, it was. Officer Langley, a towering figure built like a college ball player who never quite let go of his glory days, opened the diner door. His partner, Officer Ree, shorter and square-faced, a clipboard tucked securely under one arm, followed in his wake. They moved with an assured confidence, as if they'd walked into this very diner 100 times before. Because in all likelihood, they had. Carla spotted them first, her professional smile stretching a little too thin. "Morning, officers, usual table," she offered, but her words hung unanswered. Langley's eyes were already locked on Clarence, a predatory focus. "Sir," he stated, his voice resonating as he approached the booth. "Are you a customer here?" Clarence blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement, then nodded. "I am?" Langley's gaze remained unwavering. "You buy anything?" "Coffee? Breakfast on the way?" Reese asked, his voice laced with an implied challenge. Langley's gaze flicked to the counter. "You got a receipt?" Carla stepped forward, a protective edge to her voice. "He's fine. He's here all the time." Langley didn't even spare her a glance. "Did I ask you?" Carla's mouth opened, ready with a retort, but Harold, from behind the counter, raised a placating hand. "Don't, Carla," he said softly, a quiet warning. Clarence remained perfectly still, his voice unwavering, his composure undisturbed. "I paid. She took the order. You can ask her." Reese squinted, his tone hardening. "You carrying ID?" Slowly, deliberately, Clarence leaned back in his seat, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. He produced an old leather wallet, its edges cracked with age, and slid a VA card across the table. Langley snatched it, his eyes scanning it dismissively before scoffing. "This is all you got?" "It's all I need," Clarence replied, his voice calm, even. Reese let out a short, mirthless laugh, as if Clarence had just delivered a joke only he found amusing. "Yeah, we'll see." But before they could even utter the words to demand his departure, a heavy silence fell over the diner. A strange, suffocating pressure began to build, the kind that whispers of impending trouble, of things about to go terribly, irrevocably wrong. Reese stepped in closer, his arms folded across his chest, appraising Clarence as if measuring him for a mugshot. "How long you been here?" he demanded. Clarence glanced up at the clock mounted on the wall. "About 30 minutes. Langley tilted his head, a faint sneer playing on his lips. "And how long you planning on staying?" Clarence's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, a barely perceptible shift. But his voice remained steadfastly calm. "Long enough to eat my breakfast like everyone else." Just then, Carla slid his plate onto the table, trying subtly to avoid making it seem rushed. "Here you go, Mr. Dupri." Langley raised an eyebrow, a dismissive gesture. "He already ordered." This time, Carla didn't back down. "He comes in every Tuesday, pays cash, always polite. He's a regular, sir." Reese turned back to Clarence, his gaze piercing. "You homeless?" Clarence nodded slowly, deliberately. "I don't have a house, no. But I got a home in this town." Langley smirked, a cold glint in his eye. "You got smart answers, huh?" Clarence said nothing. He simply picked up his fork, a silent, almost futile gesture, as if the act of eating might make them disappear. It didn't. "You see, this is the problem," Langley declared, his voice rising as he gestured around the diner as if addressing a captive audience. "People think they can just camp out wherever they want, take advantage of kind folks like you all. Is that fair to everyone else in here?" Nobody answered. Nobody wanted to escalate the situation. A couple at the next table stared intently at their plates. A delivery driver waiting for a pickup shifted awkwardly near the door. But no one uttered a word. Clarence cut a piece of egg, chewed it slowly, swallowed, then meticulously wiped his mouth with his napkin. "I served in Iraq twice. Came back. Worked security in Alabama until my knees gave out. I get by. I don't steal. I don't beg. I pay for my food. So, why are you talking to me like I broke into somebody's house? Langley chuckled, a hollow sound devoid of any humor. Relax. Just doing our job, making sure everything's in order. Carla stepped forward again, her eyes sharp, indignant. Then check the register. He paid. I rang him up. What else do you need? But Langley ignored her. Reese pulled out a small notepad. Name, he demanded. Clarence raised an eyebrow, a hint of defiance in the gesture. It's right there on the card. I asked for your name out loud, Reese repeated, his voice firm, unwavering. Clarence Dupri. Date of birth, February 10th, 1968. Langley looked at Ree, a silent command passing between them. Run it! Reese turned and began to walk towards the counter. Reese walked back towards the cruiser, muttering something under his breath. Harold finally emerged from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. Officers, can I talk to you outside a moment? He asked, his voice firm. Langley waved him off. We're good, sir. No, you're not, Harold retorted, his voice gaining a hard edge. That man has never caused trouble in my business. Do you have an actual reason to be here? Or are we just harassing veterans now? Langley finally turned to him, his expression hardening. Sir, we're responding to a complaint. From who? Harold pressed, a frown deepening on his face. Langley didn't answer. He simply shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes still fixed on Clarence, as if waiting for him to make a single misstep. Clarence finished the last bite of his toast, pushing his plate slightly forward as if to signal he was done. He wiped his hands meticulously with his napkin and reached into his jacket pocket once more. This time, he pulled out a scratched-up flip phone, the kind almost nobody used anymore, except perhaps someone like him. What's that? Langley demanded, his voice already edged with suspicion. Clarence flipped it open with one hand, pressed a number on speed dial, and waited. Harold leaned in, a worried Clarence on his lips, but Clarence simply raised one finger, a silent signal. The line clicked. He brought the phone to his ear. A pause. Then, as calmly as ever, he spoke. It's happening again. And just like that, everything in the room shifted. No one in the diner knew what that call meant, but the silence it left in its wake was loud enough to rattle the windows. Langley's eyes narrowed, watching. Clarence as if he had just pulled the pin from a grenade. Who the hell did you just call? He demanded, his voice tight with alarm. Clarence didn't flinch, didn't answer. Instead, he calmly closed the flip phone, set it on the table next to his plate, and leaned back into the booth. You said you were just doing your job, Clarence said, his voice low and steady. Now I'm doing mine. Langley stepped forward, puffed up with authority, his hands resting on his duty belt. Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up and come outside with me. Harold had reached his limit. No, he's not going anywhere, not unless you're arresting him. Just then, Reese returned from the patrol car, a tablet in his hand. Name checks out, he muttered, scrolling through the screen. VA database confirms veteran status. Honorable discharge, 2 tours. Bronze Star. Langley didn't even blink. He homeless? Yeah, no fixed address. Was cited last year in Albany for loitering. Langley nodded, as if that was the only confirmation he needed. Then he's a drifter? Doesn't belong sitting here all day taking up space? Carla slammed her notepad down onto the counter, a sharp clap echoing through the waiting. You've You've got regulars who sit for hours sipping one cup of coffee and nobody says a word, but you come in here and go after the one man who actually earned that right. Langley whirled on her, pointing a stern finger. Ma'am, I'd advise you to step back. You don't get to advise me in my own workplace, she snapped back, her voice shaking with righteous anger. Clarence remained seated, calm and still, but his fingers began to drum lightly on the edge of the table, once, twice, 3 times. He didn't look angry, just profoundly tired. The kind of weariness that settles deep into your bones and never truly leaves. You see me as a problem, he said to Langley, his voice quiet but clear. But I'm not the one making a scene. Langley finally snapped. That's it! Stand up! Clarence slowly rose to his feet, a quiet dignity in his posture. He seemed taller now than when he was seated, straighter too, his gaze steady as he met Langley's eyes. I don't want trouble, he stated, his voice calm. Langley's hand reached for his cuffs, a grim satisfaction on his face. You should have thought about that before you got clever. But before he could grasp Clarence's wrist, the front door swung open with a sudden force. The bell above, usually jingling a welcome, merely slapped against the wall and bounced back, a harsh, percussive sound. A man strode in, mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a smooth navy suit and dark overcoat. There was no badge visible on his chest, yet authority radiated from his every deliberate step. He moved with purpose, heading directly for Clarence's booth without even a glance around the diner. He held up a black leather ID case. Assistant Director Mark Sorrell, Department of Justice. Langley froze, his hands suspended awkwardly halfway to his cuffs. Sorrell's voice was crisp, calm, and utterly lethal. Officers, I'm going to need your badge numbers now, Reese stammered, caught off guard. Sir, we were just responding to a... There was no complaint, Sorrell cut in, his voice unwavering. We monitor certain keywords on open radio lines. You're both recorded. Both of you were violating departmental protocol the moment you started questioning a civilian without cause. This man is a veteran, not a suspect. Langley's face flushed a deep, mortified red. With all due respect, you're not our supervisor. No, Sorrell replied, his voice chillingly precise. I'm your investigation. Clarence didn't utter a word. He simply sat back down, a smooth, deliberate movement, as if none of this came as any surprise to him. Harold exhaled through his nose, a long, deep breath of relief. Carla's eyes were wide, darting between the men as if she were watching a courtroom drama unfold live on daytime television. Langley looked around the room, a dawning realization spreading across his face. Everyone was watching. Everyone had heard. Everyone had seen. And there was nothing he could do now. But the worst part for those officers was the camera on Reese's chest, still rolling, capturing every damning second. More than enough to change everything. Sorrell didn't sit. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I suggest you both step outside now. Langley and Ree hesitated, like boys caught red-handed doing something they knew their mothers wouldn't approve of. But eventually they turned and walked out without another word, heads down, shoulders tight with defeat. The diner remained quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of hush that watches, that observes, that judges. Clarence reached for his coffee cup, still warm. Sorrell remained standing beside the booth, his hands clasped behind his back. He leaned in just slightly, his voice low, audible only to Clarence. You all right? Clarence nodded. Didn't want to call you. I know, Sorrel replied, a hint of understanding in his tone. But you were right, too. Carla finally found her voice, a breathless whisper. Wait, what just happened? Who is he? Clarence glanced up at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Friend from the old days. Harold crossed his arms, still trying to process the scene. You got friends who walk in with a DOJ badge and shut down cops mid-complaint? Clarence gave the faintest of smiles, a subtle curve of his lips. Depends on the complaint. Sorrel turned to Carla and Harold, his expression professional. I apologize for the disruption. We won't be long. I just need a few minutes with Mr. Dupri. Harold nodded, still somewhat bewildered but agreeable. Say what you need. Coffee's on the house. Clarence shook his head, a quiet insistence in his voice. Put it on me. I always pay. Carla offered him a small, knowing smile, a renewed sense of respect and affection for her quiet regular. Of course you do. Sorrel settled into the booth across from Clarence, his tone shifting, less official now, like he was speaking to an old war buddy, which in fact he was. You sure you're okay? Clarence shrugged. I've had worse mornings, but I've had better too. Sorrel's eyes narrowed slightly. This is the third time this year, Clarence. Yeah. You want me to push this up the chain? Clarence didn't answer right away. He simply folded his napkin neatly and placed it beside his empty plate. Do what you gotta do. I'm tired of explaining myself to people who already made up their minds. Sorrel nodded, a shared weariness in his gaze. You shouldn't have to. Not after what you gave up for this country. Clarence's face hardened for just a second. They only care about that when I'm in uniform, not when I'm sitting in a diner trying to eat. Sorrel sighed. They'll be suspended at the very least. Clarence looked at him, his composure unwavering. I don't want apologies. I want respect. I want them to learn something that sticks. Sorrel pulled out his phone. The body cam footage will be flagged and reviewed today. You'll get an official call from Internal Affairs, probably 2 interviews, then we'll notify the press. Clarence didn't flinch. Let them see it. Maybe next time they'll think twice. Outside the diner window, Reese was pacing by the patrol car, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Langley was on his phone, his face a stormy, pale mask of anger and frustration. Inside, Carla had resumed refilling coffee cups, but every few seconds her eyes flicked toward Clarence. She had never seen this side of him. No one here had, and that was the thing about people like Clarence. They didn't brag, they didn't yell, they just carried more than most, in silence. Sorrel rose, still silent. He placed a business card, face down, on the table. You call that number if anyone else tries anything? You understand me? Clarence nodded, a quiet affirmation. I appreciate you. Sorrel paused, looking him directly in the eye. The people that matter do. But outside, something's brewing. And what Clarence didn't know yet was that the worst was still coming, and it wasn't from the officers. It was from the internet. 2 hours later, the diner had settled back into its usual rhythm. Coffee cups clinked, forks scraped against plates, and the low murmur of morning conversation hummed beneath the crackling radio near the register. But something was different. It wasn't just that Clarence was still sitting in the same booth. It was the way people glanced at him now, longer with a mix of curiosity, respect, and a hint of hesitancy. Carla leaned in as she refilled his coffee. You sure you want to stick around? You've got half the city whispering already. Clarence shrugged. I didn't do anything wrong. Harold grunted from behind the counter. You didn't? But folks don't care about facts. They care about drama. Clarence took a sip of his coffee. Then they better bring their own cup. I'm not pouring it. That elicited a small chuckle from Carla, but it didn't last long. The bell above the door rang again. This time, it wasn't a cop. It wasn't a regular customer. It was a teenage girl in a hoodie and sweatpants holding her phone as if it were glued to her hand, her eyes wide with urgency. "You him?" she asked, stepping directly toward Clarence's booth without preamble. Clarence looked up, confused. "You're the guy from the video, right? The veteran at Henry's Diner?" Clarence frowned, a puzzled expression on his face. "How you is all over TikTok," she interrupted, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Somebody posted the body cam footage, tagged the location. It's everywhere. My brother's in college, and he saw it." Clarence leaned back, his jaw tight. "That was fast." "Fast?" She laughed, incredulous. "You're trending, man. People are pissed. Those cops. Twitter's eating them alive." Harold walked over, his brow furrowed in concern. "Wait, who posted the footage?" "Don't know," the girl replied, quickly scrolling on her phone. "But it's got over 400,000 views in like 2 hours. Carla put a hand on her hip. "What exactly does the video show?" The girl turned the screen. "Here! Look!" On the tiny screen, Reese's body cam flickered to life. You could hear Langley asking Clarence for ID, Carla trying to speak up. You could see the exact moment Langley reached for his cuffs, and then Clarence quietly pulling out his flip phone to make the call. Then, the dramatic arrival of Sorrel. It played out like a scene in a movie. Clarence looked away. He didn't like watching himself on screens. It felt like being peeled open in front of strangers. "People are calling you a hero," the girl said, her voice softer now. "Like a silent warrior kind of hero. There's even a hashtag, a Clarence Dupri." Clarence shook his head. "I'm not a hero." "You're not invisible anymore," she said gently, then turned and walked out just as quickly as she'd come in. Carla pulled out her own phone, tapped around for a moment, then looked at Clarence, her eyes wide. "She's right. You're all over. There are articles popping up. Even a reporter from Savannah is asking for an interview." Clarence sighed, a deep, weary sound. "That's not what I wanted." "You sure?" Harold asked, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Because maybe it's what we needed. People finally seeing what's been happening right under their noses." Clarence didn't answer. He looked down at the VA card still sitting on the edge of the table. That little piece of plastic had never gotten him a job, never secured him an apartment, never even earned him a simple thank you when he needed it most. But now it was viral content. And that felt complicated. But outside, behind the scenes, bigger forces were waking up. Because when the internet gets involved, stories don't just spread, they explode. By noon, Clarence's name wasn't just floating around social media, it was running across the bottom of national news tickers. Local station WRBL picked up the footage, calling it another egregious example of unchecked authority. CNN ran a short segment before lunch. By evening, the video had been clipped, stitched, remixed, and dissected by every online pundit with a webcam and an opinion. People wanted to know who this quiet, steady man was, where he came from, what he'd been through, and how 2 local cops had become so brazenly comfortable disrespecting him in broad daylight. The internet started digging, and that's when the truth about Clarence Dupri began to emerge. It started with an old photograph, black and white, grainy, taken somewhere in Fallujah. Clarence stood beside two other men, all in full combat gear, uniforms crusted with sand, rifles slung over their shoulders. Exhaustion was etched in their eyes. The caption read, Operative Clarence Dupri, Task Force Wolfhound 2006. The Internet, not knowing what Task Force Wolfhound was, dug deeper. It turned out to be a covert joint operations unit specializing in hostage recovery missions. Classified work, most of its files sealed. But veterans talk, quietly, respectfully. And when one of them shared a redacted commendation letter addressed to Clarence, dated 2007, the story broke wide open. This wasn't just some regular grunt. Clarence Dupri had saved people. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times. There were no interviews with him on record, no medals hung on any wall, no speeches or ceremonies, just a quiet paper trail of extraordinary excellence, hidden in plain sight. Back in the diner, Clarence had no clue how far things had escalated. He didn't do Twitter, he didn't care for TikTok. He was sitting in the same booth, flipping through a local newspaper that hadn't even caught wind of the story yet. Then Sorrell called again. "You might want to prepare yourself," he said. "For what?" Clarence asked, his voice even. "The phones are ringing off the hook. Congressional offices, newsrooms, a few big-name vets from D.C. want to shake your hand. Some nonprofit even wants to buy you a house." Clarence blinked, a slow, disbelieving blink. "Buy me a house?" "Yeah. You're the Internet's newest hero." Clarence laughed under his breath, a sound devoid of joy, filled only with disbelief. "All I did was sit down for breakfast?" "No." Sorrell corrected him gently. "You stood up without standing up." Clarence looked out the window. The world outside felt like it was speeding up without asking if he wanted to come along. He didn't like being the center of attention. He had spent years trying not to be noticed, but now strangers were turning him into a symbol. Some for justice, some for contempt. Carla walked by and slid a small box onto the table. "Someone from the VA Center dropped that off for you." Inside, a clean button-up shirt, a pair of new boots, a prepaid phone, and a note that simply read, "Thank you, Sergeant Dupri." Clarence stared at it for a long moment. He didn't need gifts. He needed peace. But maybe this was the cost of forcing the world to look at something it had ignored for too long. "Harold," Clarence said quietly, "you ever feel like people don't see you until it's too late?" Harold didn't look up from the register, his voice flat. "Only every damn day." But what Clarence didn't know yet was that the video, his video, was about to force a conversation in places he never imagined, places that usually pretended men like him didn't exist. The video didn't fade like most trending clips. It grew. By Thursday morning, the Macon Police Department issued a formal statement. "We are conducting a full investigation into the incident involving Mr. Clarence Dupri." But the Internet didn't want a statement. They wanted action. They wanted names, and they already had them. Within hours, Officer Reed deleted his social media accounts. Officer Langley tried to go private, but not before someone screenshotted his Facebook comments from years ago. Some of it was bad. Real bad. The kind of bigotry and hateful rhetoric that made stomachs churn. The kind of bigotry and hateful rhetoric that made stomachs churn. The kind of stuff that made you wonder how he ever wore a badge to begin with. Protesters gathered outside the department headquarters. Not thousands, not even hundreds, just enough to fill a sidewalk. A quiet, determined line of folks holding signs that read, "I am Clarence Dupri. No chants, no screaming, just presence. That's all it took. Meanwhile, journalists began peeling back the layers. It turned out this wasn't Langley's first complaint for profiling, or even his fifth. There were reports filed and forgotten, citizens who didn't know who to call, letters that never reached the right desk, but Clarence did, and his one call knocked the entire tree. At the diner, things had undeniably changed. Carla had been interviewed twice. Harold's photo was on a local blog. Customers showed up just to sit in the booth Clarence had occupied. One guy even asked to take a selfie with the chair. Clarence just shook his head at it all. "I'm not an attraction," he mumbled. "You're a mirror," Carla replied, her voice soft. "People just don't like what they see when they look in." Still, Clarence didn't feel like a hero. Heroes got rest. They got safe. He was still sleeping in the same shelter, still folding his jacket into a pillow at night, still stretching old pain out of his knees every morning. But something was different now. One evening, a van pulled up outside the shelter. Two men in suits emerged and asked for Clarence. They handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. It offered a sincere apology for how he'd been treated, an expedited housing voucher, a dedicated counselor, a caseworker, and access to a therapist. "I didn't ask for this," Clarence said, holding the letter as if it were a riddle he couldn't quite solve. "No, sir," the younger man replied, his voice earnest. "But you earned it that night." Clarence didn't sleep much. He lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the men he'd served with who hadn't made it back, who never got letters, who never went viral, who were just forgotten. By Friday, the officers were suspended. The mayor of Macon gave a press conference, stumbling through an apology that sounded like it had been written by lawyers. The chief of police offered equally hollow words. But it didn't matter much. Public pressure did what bureaucracy never could. Reese resigned. Langley refused. But with the investigation heating up and more old cases being re-examined, his badge was hanging by a thread. Even the union knew he was dead weight now. Clarence watched it all unfold from a bench outside the shelter. There was a camera crew waiting nearby, but he wasn't interested. Not today. He lit a cigarette. He didn't usually smoke, but some days just called for it. An older woman walked by, recognized him, and paused. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Clarence didn't ask for what. He just nodded, because maybe, finally, people were starting to understand something he'd known for years. Respect isn't something you give to people like him out of pity. It's something they deserve. And if it took one phone call, one diner, and one bad morning to teach that lesson, so be it. But there's always more to a story. There was still one thing left to say, and Clarence knew it wouldn't come from a press release or a protest. It had to come from him. The following Sunday morning, the diner was unusually quiet. No cameras, no news vans, just the regulars again. The locals who came for Harold's eggs and Carla's gossip. The ones who were here before the headlines and would be here long after they disappeared. Clarence walked in wearing that same army jacket, but now his posture was different. Not stiff, not proud, just present, like someone who knew exactly where he stood, even if the ground beneath him kept shifting. Harold nodded toward his usual booth. "It's open." Clarence didn't sit. He cleared his throat, and for a moment, nobody noticed. Then Carla saw him. "Mr. Dupri?" she said, setting down a tray. "I got something to say," Clarence replied, his eyes scanning the room. The diner quieted, a collective stillness settling over the patrons. "I'm not a hero," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I didn't plan to be a story. I came in for eggs and coffee like always, like I have every Tuesday for years." He looked at Harold, then Carla. "Y'all saw me not as a problem, not as a project, but as a person." He turned to the others in the diner. "But some folks, they didn't. And maybe now that video got out, people are paying attention. That's good, but attention isn't the same as understanding." A few heads nodded slowly. One man lowered his fork, his breakfast forgotten. "See?" Clarence continued, tapping his chest lightly. "I wore this jacket in the desert. I watched men I loved die in the dirt for a country that forgets us the moment we take off the uniform." His voice stayed even, calm, but every word hit with the force of a hammer. "I didn't ask for praise. I asked for a seat. I didn't demand a parade, just a plate." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "And still, I had to prove I belong." Clarence stepped forward now, facing the room, his presence filling the space. "There are thousands like me. You won't see them on the news, you won't hear their names. Some are homeless, some are working jobs with bad knees and broken backs. Some just stopped talking because they got tired of being invisible." He held up a hand, a silent plea for their full attention. "But hear this. Being poor isn't a crime. Being tired isn't a weakness. And asking to be treated like a human being should never be met with suspicion." Carla wiped her cheek, trying to make it look like she was just rubbing her eye. It didn't work. Clarence smiled gently, a hint of melancholy in his expression. "We all walk into places carrying stories no one sees. So the next time you see someone who looks like they don't belong, maybe they do. Maybe they belong more than you know." He nodded once, a subtle gesture of completion, and finally took his usual seat. Nobody clapped. Nobody needed to. Sometimes the truth is loudest when it's quiet. The rest of the morning, folks came and went. Some left cash on Clarence's table without a word. One woman handed him a handwritten letter and walked away. Harold brought him another coffee without asking. That afternoon, Clarence walked over to the shelter one last time. He packed his meager belongings. The apartment key from the VA was cold in his hand, strange and heavy. Later that week, the first news story faded, then the next. Social media found someone new to obsess over, rage over. The world moved on, but Clarence didn't. He planted roots in a new neighborhood, one that saw him for who he was. A place where people knocked on his door not to question him, but simply to say hello. He began volunteering at a nearby school, speaking to kids about service, about silence, about dignity. The staff didn't quite know how to introduce him, so they didn't. They simply said, "This is Mr. Dupri. You'll want to hear what he has to say." Because it turned out, people listened now. But more importantly, they looked and they saw. Let this story be a reminder. Not every hero wears a cape. Some wear jackets older than you. Some sit quietly with coffee. Some fight battles you'll never hear about. Respect doesn't come after you're gone. It should come while you're still here. So the next time you cross paths with someone who looks forgotten, speak. Don't stare. Listen. Don't assume. And when you can, stand up, even if it's just by sitting down beside them. If this story moved you, take a moment today to check on someone who's been overlooked. Say something kind. Buy them a coffee. Look them in the eye.